The year is 1944. Inside the grand ballroom of the Mount Washington Hotel, the air is thick with cigar smoke and the scent of a dying empire. British economist John Maynard Keynes is arguably the smartest man in the room, yet he is losing. He proposes a neutral global currency called the Bancor, a system designed to be fair to all nations. Across the table, the Americans simply point to the vaults. At that moment, the United States holds nearly 3/4 of the world's gold and half its industrial power. The debate wasn't about math, it was about gravity. By the time the delegates went home, the British pound, the currency that had financed the Industrial Revolution, was effectively a secondary relic. The world didn't choose the dollar because it was morally better. The world accepted it because in the ruins of war, there was nothing else left standing. But today, as we watch debt ceilings crumble and digital rivals rise, a haunting question remains. If the historical handover from the pound to the dollar took decades of erosion, why hasn't it happened again? Why, despite every prediction of collapse, are we still trapped in the dollar's orbit? Most people think a dollar is a piece of paper in their wallet. It isn't. It is an entry in a global ledger that the world is forbidden from closing. And right now, that ledger possesses a specific feature that no other currency on earth can offer: depth. To understand why the dollar remains king, you must stop looking at the cash and start looking at the debt. The foundation of the dollar's empire is not the Federal Reserve notes. It is the United States Treasury market. This is a $25 trillion ocean of liquidity. It is the only financial pool on the planet deep enough for a foreign central bank or a multinational corporation to park billions of dollars instantly, without crashing the price. This creates a psychological paradox that baffles the average observer. When the US economy falters, or when Washington plays reckless games with the debt ceiling, logic suggests investors should flee. But they don't. They flock. During the 2008 crisis and the 2020 pandemic, capital didn't run away from the epicenter of the chaos, it ran towards it. Why? Because in the world of high finance, safety is not about the absence of risk, it is about the presence of an exit door. Investors buy American debt not because they trust American politicians, but because they know that if they need to sell, there will always be a buyer. The euro markets are too fragmented by national borders. The Chinese markets are restricted by capital controls. The dollar bond market is the only game in town where you can move a mountain of money without moving the market. This brings us to the mechanism that locks the sell door, the network effect. Think of the dollar not as a currency, but as the operating system of global commerce. You don't use Microsoft Windows because you admire the architecture. You use it because every piece of software you own runs on it, and changing your operating system would require rewriting the entire code of your economy. The dollar is the language of international pricing. Copper in Chile, wheat in Ukraine, and microchips in Taiwan are all priced in dollars. To trade without it is to speak a language that no one else understands. Critics love to hate the chef, yet they keep ordering the same dish simply because it's the only kitchen open 24/7. Today, nearly 90% of all foreign exchange transactions involve the dollar. It is a dominance so absolute that it has become invisible, like the air we breathe, noticed only when it is gone. But a ledger, no matter how deep, is only a record of promises. For a currency to truly rule, it needs more than just trust. It needs a physical necessity. It needs to be the key to the one resource the industrial world cannot survive without. In 1973, the ledger found its anchor, and the what became the only thing that matters. In 1971, when President Nixon closed the gold window, the dollar effectively became a ghost. For the first time in modern history, the world's reserve currency was backed by nothing but promises. The anchor was gone. The dollar began to drift, and for a moment, it looked like the American century was ending. To survive, the currency needed a new host, and it found one, not in a bank vault, but in the deserts of Saudi Arabia. The turning point came with the oil shock of 1973. Prices quadrupled overnight. The global economy panicked. But while the world saw a crisis, Washington saw an opportunity. In July 1974, Treasury Secretary William Simon was sent to Riyadh with a mission so sensitive that for decades the specific details were kept entirely off the official books. The deal they struck was elegant in its simplicity and brutal in its effectiveness. The United States would provide the House of Saud with military protection and endless hardware. In exchange, the Saudis agreed to price their oil exclusively in US dollars. But the genius of the deal wasn't just the pricing, it was the plumbing. This is where the concept of petrodollar recycling was born. Here is how the machine actually works. The United States prints dollars to buy oil. The Saudis receive those dollars, but instead of sitting on cash, they are contractually and economically incentivized to plow those billions back into the US deficit. They use the oil money to buy US Treasury bonds. It is a closed loop of infinite leverage. The money leaves the Federal Reserve, takes a round trip to the Middle East, and ends up right back in Washington, financing the very government that printed it. Consider the difference for any other nation. If Germany or Japan wants to import energy, they must manufacture cars or electronics, sell them to the world to earn dollars, and then buy the oil. They have to work for their energy. The United States simply has to print for it. Economists call this recycling. In any other context, history would call it a tribute paid to the emperor. This transformed the dollar from a currency of choice into a currency of necessity. Every nation that needed energy, which is every nation on Earth, was forced to stockpile dollars, not because they trusted the Fed and not because they liked American foreign policy. They hoarded dollars simply to keep the lights on. This single mechanism created a permanent artificial demand for the dollar that had nothing to do with the health of the American economy. It allowed the US to run deficits that would bankrupt any other empire. This arrangement created what Valéry Giscard d'Estaing famously called the exorbitant privilege. It built a world where the US could export its inflation to the rest of the globe. But history reminds us of one uncomfortable truth. Privileges are rarely surrendered voluntarily. They are usually maintained until the cost of keeping them exceeds the value they provide. And for 50 years, no one dared to challenge the cost, until they realized that the privilege relies on a timeline that is slower than we think. Turn on the financial news today and you will hear a familiar frantic drumbeat. The pundits will tell you the collapse is imminent. They say the dollar is days away from zero. But if you close the browser and open the archives, you find a very different reality. Currency deaths are not heart attacks. They are slow, agonizing cancers. Common wisdom tells us that the US dollar replaced the British pound after World War II, once the smoke had cleared in 1945, but common wisdom is off by about 20 years. Data from the European Central Bank reveals a startling discrepancy. The dollar had actually overtaken the pound in global bond markets as early as 1929, before the Great Depression truly took hold, before Hitler came to power, and long before the Second World War began. The financial torch had already been passed. Yet for nearly 2 more decades, the world continued to price trade in pounds, central banks continued to hold sterling, and the British Empire pretended nothing had changed. Why the delay? The answer lies in a powerful, invisible economic force called inertia. Global finance is not a speedboat that turns on a dime. It is a supertanker. Central banks are conservative beasts by nature. They hate change. To switch reserve currencies requires repricing billions in contracts, retraining entire banking sectors, and taking massive risks on a new, untested system. This creates a sticky power. Even when a currency is fundamentally broken, the world will cling to it simply because the cost of leaving is too high. The dollar didn't win just because America was rich. It won because America built a financial market so deep and so sophisticated that by the 1930s the pound simply couldn't compete with the liquidity of New York. Liquidity is a gravity well. The bigger it gets, the harder it is to escape. Political empires can crumble in a single weekend. Currencies, it seems, take a generation to pack their bags. This history teaches us that the collapse is not an event, it is a process. We are likely living through that process right now, but it moves at the speed of a glacier, not a tweet. However, if history is a slow game of replacement, then we must look at the current challenger. For 20 years we were promised a new rival, a currency designed specifically to dethrone the dollar, yet it seems stuck in the mud. If history is a slow-moving glacier, then why does the current challenger, the euro, seem unable to move at all? In 1999, the euro was born with a singular, quiet ambition to look the dollar in the eye. Today it is a formidable currency, used in nearly every corner of global trade and stored in vaults from Tokyo to Brazil. Yet despite its size, the euro remains a giant that cannot seem to leave its own backyard. It is the world's permanent silver medalist, forever waiting for a gold that never comes. To understand why, we have to look at what lies beneath the surface of the European project. When you buy a US Treasury bond, you are buying a piece of the safety of the entire United States. It is a single deep and liquid pool of debt. But when an investor wants to park €1 billion in a safe asset, they face a puzzle. There is no such thing as a European Treasury bond. Instead, there is a fragmented market. You must choose between the ironclad safety of a German Bund or the higher yield risk of an Italian BTP. This is the euro's fatal structural flaw: fragmentation. Because the eurozone lacks a unified fiscal heart, it cannot provide the scale of safe assets the global financial system demands. It is a currency without a country, a unified wallet for a deeply divided family. Then there is the matter of the balance sheet. While the United States runs massive trade deficits, effectively exporting dollars to the rest of the world so the world can use them, Europe does the opposite. Europe saves and maintains a massive current account surplus, meaning it is a net lender to the world, not a provider of liquidity. By hoarding its own wealth, Europe inadvertently starves the global market of the very currency it wants people to use. It is a dry irony. The more Europe tries to prove its fiscal discipline, the less useful its currency becomes as a global reserve. Today, the European Central Bank is pushing for a digital euro, a strategic move to protect its monetary sovereignty in a world dominated by foreign digital platforms. It is a defensive perimeter, designed to ensure that European payments stay in European hands. But a defensive wall is not a path to dominance. The euro was designed as a shield, a way to protect the continent from the volatility of others. But a shield, no matter how strong, cannot win a war of conquest. Without a unified political will and a permanent shared debt market, the euro remains a sophisticated tool for internal stability, but a failure as a global king. It seems that for now the euro is content to be the world's most reliable insurance policy, but the dollar has evolved into something far more active. It has become a weapon. On February 26, 2022, the definition of a safe asset changed forever. The world watched in a state of clinical shock as the dollar was transformed from a neutral utility into a digital kill switch. By freezing the central bank reserves of a G20 nation, the United States didn't just punish an adversary, it signaled to every capital on earth that their savings are only theirs, as long as they remain in Washington's good graces. To understand how this is possible, you have to look at the plumbing of the global financial system. Most people assume that if a bank in Brazil sends dollars to a bank in Singapore, the money moves directly. It doesn't, because the dollar is a US liability. Almost every dollar transaction in the world eventually clears through a correspondent bank on US soil. This gives the US Treasury what lawyers call extraterritorial jurisdiction. If a transaction touches the American grid, it belongs to American law. The mechanism is absolute. By disconnecting banks from the SWIFT messaging system or blacklisting specific institutions, the US can effectively delete a country from the global marketplace. It is a form of financial excommunication. This is the dry irony of the modern age. The system is free to join, and it is incredibly efficient to use. But the exit door? It's locked from the outside. For decades, nations like China, Russia, and Iran viewed de-dollarization as a distant ideological goal. After 2022, it became a matter of national survival. We are seeing the rise of the petroyuan and alternative payment rails, not because these systems are better, but because they are not under the thumb of a single auditor. When you turn the world's primary medium of exchange into a weapon of war, you shouldn't be surprised when the rest of the world starts looking for a different shield. But wielding this weapon comes at a steep hidden cost to the wielder. It is a self-inflicted wound that was described decades ago by a man who saw the cracks in the foundation long before the rest of us. If the dollar is a weapon, then the hand holding it is beginning to tremble under a weight it was never meant to carry. We often hear the politicians complain about the trade deficit, about the death of American manufacturing and jobs moving overseas. But few realize that this isn't a failure of the system. It is the core feature that keeps the dollar on its throne. In 1960, a Belgian-American economist named Robert Triffin identified a trap that would eventually haunt every Federal Reserve chairman. The logic is as cold as it is inescapable. If the world uses your currency to trade, the world needs a constant growing supply of it. And there are only two ways for those dollars to leave American shores. The US must either lend them to other nations or buy things from them. This is the Triffin paradox. To provide the world with the liquidity it demands, the United States is mathematically forced to run a permanent trade deficit. It must import more than it exports. It must send its capital out, and in return it receives a mountain of consumer goods. But here is where the crown begins to burn. To maintain this global dominance, the US had to sacrifice its own industrial spine. When you see the rusted shells of factories in the Rust Belt, you aren't looking at a lack of competitiveness. You are looking at the price of being the world's reserve currency. The American worker was traded for the American banker. To be the world's banker, you must also be the world's consumer of last resort. It's a glamorous form of servitude. The US issues debt that the world buys, and then uses that debt to buy the world's products. It is a massive global treadmill, where everyone is running just to stay in the same place. The irony is forensic in its precision. The very strength that allows the US to print money from thin air is the same force that hollows out its own middle class. The exorbitant privilege has a twin brother called the exorbitant burden. Today the numbers have reached a scale that Robert Triffin could barely have imagined. The US national debt is no longer a statistic, it is a structural necessity for global stability. If the US ever decided to balance its budget and stop exporting dollars, the global financial system would choke to death in weeks. We are locked in a room where the oxygen is thin but the door is welded shut. The system is straining under the weight of this paradox. The debt is no longer just a number on a screen, it is a ticking clock. And in the cracks of this aging foundation, something new is growing. Something that doesn't need a central bank, a border, or a trade deficit to exist. Something digital. Crypto was born with a radical promise, to kill the fiat system, to liberate us from the grip of central banks and the endless printing presses of Washington. It was supposed to be the final exit door from the dollar's orbit. Yet if you look past the white papers and into the actual flow of capital, you see a story that is as ironic as it is inevitable. The data shows that over 99% of all stablecoin market capitalization is pegged directly to the US dollar. We were promised a revolution that would dismantle the dollar's hegemony. Instead, we built a digital infrastructure that has become its latest life support system. To understand the mechanism at play here, you have to look back at the euro-dollar market of the 1950s. Back then, the dollar escaped the regulatory walls of the US too and began to circulate in London banks, creating a massive pool of offshore liquidity that the Fed couldn't touch, but that everyone still needed. Today, stablecoins like Tether and USDC are doing exactly the same thing in the digital realm. They allow the dollar to bypass official banking rails and flow instantly into jurisdictions where the local currency is failing. Every time a trader in Lagos or Buenos Aires buys a dollar-pegged stablecoin to escape local inflation, they are silently voting for the very system they claim to distrust. They are creating a fresh, unregulated demand for US treasuries, because every major stablecoin issuer must hold those bonds to back their tokens. In a world where nations are trying to de-dollarize, the digital street is doing the opposite. Even the European Central Bank's push for a digital euro feels less like a challenge and more like a desperate defensive move to prevent its citizens from fleeing into dollar-backed tokens. The dry irony of our era is profound. The digital revolution against the dollar is being settled almost exclusively in dollars. We are chasing a mirage of independence while building deeper dependencies. The dollar is not being replaced, it is being digitized and decentralized, making it even harder to kill than when it was just paper and gold. So where does this leave us? We have looked at the ledgers, the bloodlines, the history, and the weapons. We see a system that is fundamentally broken, yet mathematically indispensable. The cracks are widening, but the foundation is still made of the very gravity that Keynes lost to 80 years ago. As we stand at the edge of this transition, the question is no longer who will win. The question is what happens when the OS of the global economy finally hits a fatal error. History is rarely a series of clean breaks. It is a slow, agonizing erosion. We wait for a moment, a single day when the dollar falls and the screens turn red, but the data suggests we are already living through the transition. The exorbitant privilege that once felt like a superpower now feels like a tether, binding the American economy to a global debt cycle it can no longer control. We are often told that the alternative to a dollar-led world is chaos. But perhaps the real chaos is a system that requires a single nation to be the world's perpetual debtor, just to keep the lights on. The dollar isn't going to vanish overnight, not because it is loved, but because the world hasn't figured out how to live without the liquidity it provides. The question isn't whether the dollar will be replaced. The question is when the ledger finally closes, will you be the one holding the paper, or the one who owns the assets the paper used to represent? If you value these deep dives into the mechanisms of power beyond the headlines and the hype, leave a 1 inch in the comments to let me know you're still watching the patterns. And as always, subscribe to Financial Money History for the stories the system won't tell you.